Emilie Pine, welcome to Ireland Unfiltered.
Thank you.
We're here because you've written a wonderful book, Notes to Self.
Thanks.
#1 bestseller. And I loved it. And there was a point in it later on when you talk about learning to ride a bike. And you never learned to ride a bike as a child. And you have a line in where you say, "Why can't I let go more often?" Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if the book, in some ways, was part of that process.
Yeah, and that part comes in the final essay, and it really is a kind of summing up where I reflect on why I wrote the book and the kind of urge to do it. The learning to ride a bike is funny. I moved to America for a year, and because I was there, and you know what Ireland is like, it's very small and everybody knows you, and there's that sense that you can't change, or it's very difficult to do something slightly out of the ordinary, and we all have a risk of failing and that insecurity. So the riding the bike was a literal kind of learning thing that I did, and a literal letting go where you pick your foot up off the ground and just go. But also it just becomes a metaphor for, I think, letting go of that fear of failure and really going for it and seeing what happens.
But the book has been, like, when you talk about the fear of failure, did you have concerns when you wrote the book that this was going to be you sort of throwing something out and no one would respond?
When I was writing it, I kept coming downstairs to my partner and saying, "No one is going to want to write this book." And he would say, "Just go back upstairs to the desk." I would say the same thing to Tramp Press, who commissioned and published the book. And they would say, "You do the writing, we'll do the publishing." I have to say, trusting them with my story was one of the best decisions I've made in years. There is also the fear of judgment. And about a month before the book came out, I had a total cold feet.
Did you?
And I said to Tramp, to Lisa Cohen and Sarah Davis-Goff, I said, maybe we could just publish it really quietly and no one will notice. And again, they kind of smiled and nodded and then completely ignored me and published it as noisily as they could. And because the book contains so much about my life and so many things I had never told people outside my immediate circle of family, and particularly, you know, as a professional woman, I had spent 15 years building a career, and my fear that revealing things about myself as a teenager or even myself in my 30s would somehow destabilize my professionalism. I think women can feel quite precarious at work a lot of the time, and as if we have to project a kind of persona of success, or we're handling it all, or we're great at managing everything, and to admit that you're not managing everything is a risk.
And was that something that, clearly that's a big hurdle, while all the personal stuff, and we'll get into like what's in the book in a minute, but like that sense of, well, I have a career and I I don't want to jeopardize it. Was that a big fear to overcome?
It was a big fear, because I had a teenage life that was very unstable in lots of ways. And so since I was 18 and then I got a degree and I stayed in university basically, so now I'm a university lecturer, which is a job that I love. So, you know, I really invested in it. But also I had spent a long time creating stability in my life. And it's a kind of, you know, it's two sides of the same coin. In one sense, the reason I can write a book and reveal these things is because I am safe now. Yeah. And I feel in a secure place in my life, both personally and professionally. But then you think, oh, what am I doing? Letting all this out there. But I have to say the fears that I had before publication have not come to pass at all. So ever since the book has been out, people that I would have expected, like my friends, have been really pleased. But so many people that I have never met and don't know beyond them emailing me or sending me letters, because I'm a public servant, my email is easily available, and they get in touch and they talk about what the book meant to them and how they don't feel the need or the ability to tell their story publicly, but they're so glad that somebody else is.
Was that part of the is that the idea when you write something like this, in a sense? Like, did you expect, I know you had that fear, but did you expect that you could make that connection with people?
It was the entire point of it.
Was it?
Right, why else? Yeah. I mean, my life is not extraordinary and I have no interest in talking about myself. But I thought, and it was funny, my mother was a bit concerned about me publishing the book. She was really supportive, and she said, I completely understand why you would want to write it. I'm not sure why you would want to publish it. And my sister actually said it to her. We were, on a kind of family holiday, and my sister turned around and said, other people might read Emilie's story and feel that it talks about their lives, and that would make it worthwhile. And that for me has made it completely worthwhile.
Let's talk a little bit then, like the opening chapter, which I think is where the idea for the book took hold. Was that how you conceived it once you wrote the chapter about your father and his drinking?
Yeah, it kind of evolved out of a need to write it down. So in 2013, my dad went into liver failure, and he'd been an alcoholic all my life. And after 4 decades of abuse, his body was just shutting down. He was bleeding and from a hole in his esophagus, a hole burnt by decades of alcohol. And he lives in Greece, so that added another layer to it. And he went into intensive care. The good news is that he's still alive and he's not drinking, 2 facts that I could not have imagined a few years ago. But even in the year, even though that was good news and he came off the liver transplant list in 2014, which is amazing, it felt like it still felt very chaotic. And like there were a lot of emotions, and as anybody who deals with anybody or loves anybody who has addiction issues knows, there are a lot of really complicated emotions that go with that. And so I had to write them down, and I didn't write them down with the conception of an essay even, and certainly not a collection, but I wrote them down to just try and get them out of my head. My partner read some of the notes that I had written. They really were notes, like a journal. He said it's really good, and that I had captured somehow that sense of the emotional chaos of it, as well as the logistics of hospitals, in and out, and days on trolleys in A&E and all the rest. But it took me 2 years to build up the courage to show them to anybody else.
And like you talk in the book about the sort of that as children of addicts or alcoholics, you develop a particular kind of watchfulness. Yeah. And again, I'm thinking about the process of doing this, and like, as you say, there was still chaos there, but like that again must be something that it remains, even though your father has stopped drinking, like a lifetime of having that particular kind of watchfulness that children of alcoholics do develop, because you're always on eggshells.
You're always on alert, for that trigger and behaviour. That little calculation that you do from, very, very young, where you try and work out how drunk is this person? Is this person sober enough to have a conversation? Is this person going to fly into a rage? Is this person about to throw something? And, what distance, both literal physical distance and emotional distance, do I need to put between myself and that person? And you do that calculation. It is extraordinary to me now that I have managed to relax it to the extent that I have, that I don't, for a long time, for years, I was monitoring whether I thought he wasn't drinking or not, and whether I trusted him enough, because trust is the first thing to go. But he isn't, and I think everybody needs to hit rock bottom, and luckily he managed to live past rock bottom, because it came really, really close. But the watchfulness, there's a kind of resilience that it breeds, I think, in children as well, and then also a real sense of silence. So part of writing the book was about saying to the world, because a lot of people wouldn't have attached necessarily the word alcoholic to my dad,
really,
which is extraordinary to me. And it was only when he was in liver failure and people said, oh, I didn't realise he was that bad. Right. And you're like, I think we have this idea that to be an alcoholic, you have to be in a gutter somewhere or completely insensible most of the time. But functional alcoholism is something we need to talk about the fact that people get up every day and go to work, but it doesn't mean they don't have an alcohol problem.
But where does that come from, do you think? Because there's always perhaps cliched and idea of the link between writers and artists and drink and these kind of things. But reading your book again, I was thinking, and when you talk about the connection, like art does come from a place where you're trying to make a connection with people, and maybe does the drinker have a kind of an inability to connect in any other way, because that it is a way, like it starts off as an idea of kind of, I'm going to have a drink and let me meet a few people and let my inhibitions down and all that kind of stuff. So is there some connection there, do you think?
Maybe there is something to do with inhibitions, as you say, that artists or writers, in the case of my dad and me, I'm not an alcoholic, but I wrote a book, it's perfectly possible.
Yeah.
I think that sometimes creativity can be linked to letting your guard down, being completely open about things, and also extremes of experience, emotional experience. Like, where do you get what you write about? Now, I've written a book about my life. Yeah. So, in observing my dad and observing my own emotional reaction to that, and to my sister's life as well, my younger sister, I have a story to tell as a result. Again, one of the things people would have always said about my dad was that, he was always the life and soul of the party. He always had great anecdotes and stuff. And I think that maybe drinkers get put into that, telling funny stories kind of pigeonhole, and and you hone it. It is something that you pay for your drinks with stories.
And you develop
being the entertainer.
Yeah, and as you say, a functioning alcoholic develops devices and strategies that mean that the drinking or whatever doesn't have to be addressed, because they bring stories, they bring something.
Yeah, but I don't think my dad is not an alcoholic because he's a creative person. My dad is an alcoholic because he's depressed.
Yeah,
and because alcohol is a form of coping with that depression or a response to it, and that then feeds the depression further. Yeah. He would probably have a very different version to that. My father would say, and has said publicly, that he drank because he enjoyed to drink and because it made him feel better, and he doesn't regret it. So we can have, and that's fine. He can have his version of his own life. And it's one of the things I talk about in the book, is it's really difficult then. My memories are very different to his memories. And for us to find a place where those stories can meet has been actually one of the good byproducts of writing the book, because he has said, I didn't understand, I didn't know you felt like that.
And you mentioned in the book, he wrote an article for the Irish Times, which you felt didn't really get to that brutal hurt from you and your sister's point of view.
No, he says that he does not regret a single day of his drinking life. And he describes myself and my sister as walking saints. And again, you know when you're being palmed off, right? When someone is saying, "Oh, you're a saint," which means you're actually being far too nice, and you have broken your own boundaries, and in order to support me, and it doesn't really acknowledge the hurt done, and it doesn't to either side, because he never acknowledges the hurt done to himself either. Yeah,
and he doesn't. So when he talks about it, as you said, he says it was. It wasn't out of necessity. He feels it was an enjoyment, and it
was a choice.
And he talks about it, and this is, I think, a common thing when people talk about their relationship with drink. They talk about it as a relationship with somebody, which I think maybe is why sometimes people find it hard to intervene, because you're actually dealing with somebody who has it's equivalent to coming to somebody and saying, "I don't like your partner."
It is, and in exactly the same way, that relationship takes primacy. Yeah. So you become replaced in their life by drink, whether that's just because they're too drunk to talk to you, or because they will always choose drink over you. Yeah. And it is true for addicts across this country.
And when you say that addicts build a wall, I was wondering about that. And when you talk about drinking because of depression, like, is the wall there before they become drinkers, do you think? Or is the wall, does it get, in the sense that do they try to scale it initially, if you like, through drink? Or is it something that gets higher and higher?
I don't know, because I would have to go back to the beginning, and I wasn't there. Yeah. And I can only talk about the person that I know. Yeah. I know, interestingly, there are lots of neuroscience experiments on addiction that show that whatever the substance you are abusing is, whether it's alcohol or heroin, it affects the decision-making part of your brain. And that part of your brain then is the one that you need to stop. And so in some ways you build a social and an emotional wall around yourselves, but in other ways your brain is actually being deleteriously affected so that you cannot change that behavior. I think it's funny, it's like an insulation wall, and you build it, or it forms in order to protect the addiction. but it also then stops you from connecting with anything beyond it.
And when you were 5, I think your parents separated. They didn't divorce they couldn't divorce, of course, at that time
in Ireland until 97.
And there's a very moving moment in that where your response is to say, "No more fighting."
Yeah. I mean, that's one of those odd family stories that I remember, but it's been told so many times.
Yeah.
So it's shaped by other people's remembrance as well. But that's what apparently I said when my parents said, you know, it wasn't fun living in a house with both of them. And they had to make a very, very difficult decision. I think looking back on it, I mean, there was one other separated family in my whole primary school. My mum had one friend who'd also left her husband.
Yeah.
Like, it was not early 1980s. It was not normal, and my parents were in some ways pioneers. It was really odd behaviour. I always remember growing up then and thinking that, and really respecting the decision that they had made, even though it drove me demented at times, because they had preserved for me the idea that marriage was about love.
Right.
So their marriage, that had stopped, and I don't want to speculate too much about what happened between them, because again, I don't know.
Yeah.
But that it wasn't working anymore, and as a result, they kept the idea of marriage far more sacrosanct than parents who stayed together and fought, or who very obviously and demonstrably didn't like to be in the same room as each other. My parents at least acknowledged that.
And did you feel, when you say it was such an unusual thing at Ireland at the time, did you feel self-conscious about it?
I probably didn't until other people made me feel self-conscious about it. So one of the moments I talk about in the book is how getting your school reports at, in primary school, so they don't really matter, but you get your school report at the end of the year, and I had to stay behind to get mine, because they had to give me 2 copies, one for each parent. And I'm speculating, but I don't know why they wouldn't simply give out the 2 envelopes in front of the rest of the class.
Right.
But it must be something. It created a stigma.
Yeah. And your classmates were waiting outside to...
Yeah. Oh, yeah, because kids know. Like, kids spot difference from a mile away. And they spot it, and they know that you're not wearing the same trainers as the rest of them, and your parents don't live in the same house, and your car is older than everybody else's car, and you don't go on the school trip, and all of that. Like, they smell it out. And
that was all the stuff that was happening because it was tough for your parents and tough for your mother to support you.
Single parents end up in a poverty trap, whether you're talking about 1983 or you're talking about 2019.
And the other thing that, and I come back to this as well, but like when you say that Ireland was a different place, then the thing that struck me about the stories, the essays in this book, is that that seems like a long time ago, but when you're writing the chapter on on fertility and trying to have a baby, and so the Eighth Amendment, as it was then, became a brutal kind of an accompaniment to that story as well.
Yes, well, the book is the story of my life, so I guess it goes
but
right up till now. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think Ireland has changed we're actually getting referenda right, finally. Not all of them, but the last 2 certainly, and it feels like a far more possible place to live. It's funny, my mum's job moved abroad when I was 14 in the early 1990s, and I remember talking about it with friends of mine. I mean, I was 14, but everybody thought I was really lucky to be leaving Ireland.
Right.
That was our impression in 91, 92 was, can't wait to get out of this place. And that doesn't, for me, that doesn't feel like that anymore. Obviously there are people who have to emigrate, but Ireland is a really good place to live now, I think.
But you as you put it, you had a wanted pregnancy. You wanted to have a baby.
So my partner and I tried for years to have children, and I was pregnant at one point and had a miscarriage, but the miscarriage it's called a missed miscarriage. There was no heartbeat, but there was fetal growth. And because of the then laws in the country, nobody would pronounce the pregnancy over. So the miscarriage went on for 3 weeks, and with a series of really brutal scans, brutal in the sense that they were felt emotionally brutal. Eventually we we couldn't decipher. Like, you know, when you're in that situation, you don't know what's happening, and you don't know what's happening within your own body. Like, you don't even have ownership of information of your own body. And we were distraught and desperately wanted this baby. And, you know, eventually ended up paying to go to a private clinic, and somebody very kindly broke the law effectively and said this is a non-viable pregnancy. And at least it wasn't the answer we wanted, but at least it was an answer. And because then you can actually get on with your life.
Yeah. It's such a powerful chapter because, you know, there is your struggle, then there's a tragedy that your sister had with the stillborn baby.
Both in the same maternity hospital. I really hated that building. My sister was pregnant with a baby girl who was born at 37 weeks, but whose heart stopped, Elena Jane, and we will never get over her loss. And it's not until something like that happens that you come into contact with a life that actually lots of people live. So that was one hospital. They have a stillborn child, at least one every week. There are hundreds across the country every year, and I had never heard of it before. I'd never encountered someone, or rather I thought I had never encountered someone. And when something like that happens, people start getting in touch with you and saying, oh, this happened to me. And there is a huge silence around stillbirth still, even though it is changing, and there are support groups like Féileacáin, you know, who support parents who have gone through this kind of loss, and there is Stillbirth Awareness Day, and that's all really important. And there are different kinds of silences. Part of that silence, I think, is around grief, and because the parents themselves often can't talk about it, the grief of the people around them, and the death of a baby is just incredibly distressing for everybody. But there is also a social silence or a cultural silence, as if, and obviously there were decades in which stillborn children weren't allowed to be buried in consecrated ground and all the rest, and we still have the legacy of that, I think, where it's as if that's not appropriate to talk about, and part of me thinks people just don't know how to react, and we're afraid of saying the wrong thing. We're afraid of intruding on someone's pain, so we don't say anything at all. But actually, in the weeks and months after Elena's death, one of the things my sister found hardest of all was the silence. So people not getting in touch, or people. And she subsequently had a little boy who was healthy and loud and wonderful. But people say to her, treat her as if she only has one child, and she will always say that she has two children.
And people sometimes see if a child comes along subsequently, they see it as the kind of
you're okay now.
You're okay now.
The happy ending that kind of erases the previous sadness, and he is amazing, my nephew, and a really big part of all of our lives. But you know, Elena is also a really big part of our lives.
Yeah. And when you talk about things like that, when people say, you know, these, like in the book, it says the things you shouldn't say is what we're talking about. It strikes me with areas like that, your own, you know, struggle to have a baby. Like, there's a lot of emphasis rightly put on people talking about their problems in Ireland today, but are we still able to, are we actually, you know, in some ways, are we talking about certain problems? Are we still failing to talk about certain things? Because as you say there, these things aren't addressed. We're able to talk about maybe depression, which is great, and it's very important. But the other issues that may have contributed to it, or that people are holding on to, the details, still maybe there are huge obstacles for people to actually overcome to feel comfortable talking about those.
Yeah, I think we could share more. I think when you say we talk about depression, I mean, we are starting to.
Yeah.
And I think we're starting to have a vocabulary around conditions like depression, around different kinds of loss and grief. And I think that's really worth noticing and then building upon. One of the things about the repeal referendum that really struck me was that it was through people's stories that we understood more as a country, and many people changed their minds, and particularly women's storytelling, and that through women's storytelling they actually changed how women's bodies in this country are legislated. So storytelling has this incredible power, both emotional but also logistical. And if we think that through stories we understand more and we empathize more, and we can just be then a little kinder, and that is the best thing for society, I think, is to, we could all say yes to that, to being just a little bit kinder. And those stories are really important. One of the other things, and this is not in the book, but one of the things that I do in my work is I work with survivors of institutional abuse. 2019 is the 10th anniversary of the publication of the Ryan Report, and it's the 20th anniversary of the Taoiseach Bertie Ahern and his apology to survivors of child abuse in industrial schools. And that was one of the, institutions, and we're about to come to the publication of the report on the mother and baby homes, or the mother and child institutions, which is a more accurate term for them. And those institutions were things that we, as a country, we did not talk about at all. There were walls built around them, and we just conveniently allowed those walls to stop us from thinking or stop us from talking about them. Now, in many ways, you can say that in the last 20 years, since the apology and so on, we have started a process of kind of official storytelling and then listening to those stories. But these are some of the most important stories in our country, and they are still some of the least listened to and least heard. So I bring that in because when you ask about, are there still things that we need to talk about that are painful and difficult and that we don't? And I think both on a personal level and then also on a much larger kind of national level, yes, absolutely, there are. And there is a degree to which I think we think, oh, well, we've done that. So we've ticked that box, and we've had, Miscarriage Awareness Day or Depression Awareness Day or Suicide Awareness Day, and now we're done and we move on to the next one. But just that sense of an open and compassionate culture, I think, is really important, because while we can talk about stories and the importance of people telling their stories, and there are many valid reasons why people don't talk publicly about their stories, but when we talk about people telling their stories, maybe we don't put enough emphasis on the other side, which is people listening, right? You can't have storytelling without active silence, actually, because people are listening.
That's amazing when you talk about it in terms of something like the Eighth Amendment, because it seems to be like, and I know you've written in a different context about when people say you're brave, you've said I'm not brave, I'm angry.
Yes, exactly.
And maybe
because you're still afraid, right? But now the anger outweighs the fear.
Yeah. But like the process of listening, because I think that was the thing that came from the Eighth Amendment, that these women telling stories and families telling their stories, whatever their motivation, whether it was bravery is the unhelpful word, because it sort of implies as well that the people who aren't telling their stories aren't brave,
which is not true.
But as you say, the process is as much in the listening, in what it does to the person hearing the story, and again, maybe that sense of connection between the storyteller and the audience, whether it's art or anything. Again, that's the bridge that needs to be filled, whatever situation.
Yes, and I always never get over the fact that you can just learn something every single time, and you can be surprised, and we're all really busy and rushing around and we have incredibly full lives, but just that stopping and tuning in.
How hard was it to write unsentimentally about these issues and be unflinching? Because you don't, like, you're tender and you're warm, but there isn't about yourself. There's one point in the book where you say, you used to have a recurring and sentimental idea about giving your teenage self a hug. But there is no sentimentality in the book.
Well, I like that you say that it's not sentimental, because I'm not a sentimental person. So, and I also talk about it in the book. I don't really have much empathy.
Well, yeah, I thought there was going to be a punchline in that bit that you would actually turn out to have empathy. But I was like, no, she's really going for it. She has no empathy.
I have no. But let's be clear about what empathy is. It doesn't mean that I'm not a sympathetic person or a compassionate person. I just don't really understand the feelings that other people are having, unless like they're actually crying in front of me or narrating their feelings. I'm like, okay, it's just a bit of a mystery to me, and that actually is part of the problem with that is a lack of listening, right? So it is one of the things that I have tried to do in the last couple of years is to listen better, because that's how you pick up, it turns out, on emotions. People are telling you how they feel all the time, you're just not listening, Emily. I wrote it because I really don't feel sorry for myself, so I didn't want there to be that kind of tinge of sorrow in it. I am very sad for some of the things that happened to me as a teenager. I would love to give my younger sister a massive hug, go back in time and tell her, mostly to tell our younger selves that everything is going to be okay. Right. The problem is that in doing that, the future, and you know that things aren't always going to be okay. But that sense of, sometimes when you're in crisis, well, actually always when you're in crisis, it's really hard to imagine that you're going to be okay again.
We had Lynn Ruan on the show, and
she's amazing.
She is incredible, and she talked about, she has in her book this line about, she would tell her younger self that everything is going to be okay. And I'll ask you what I asked her, which was, when did you begin to think that everything was going to be okay?
So I think education saved me, and I nearly didn't finish school, and my mother kept me in school through sheer force of will, and then I was really, really lucky, and I'm lucky because I'm quite good at exams, right? So I managed to do well in my end of school exams, and I got to university, and I finally felt like I belonged somewhere, which I don't think you notice the absence of until you find it.
But we might jump back, because when you weren't belonging, like the years leading up to that were, like when you talk about belonging, were some of the most kind of, you were adrift in so many ways and alone in so many brutal ways when you moved to London with your mother.
Yeah, it was pretty lost. I think the impact of not being able to talk, or not having a vocabulary or a language to talk about how you feel, and there being, again, we're talking about late 1980s, early 1990s, not really being a kind of mental health care package for children. And so you express it in different ways. And I didn't eat. I ate one meal a day, and was very, very thin. And then I moved to London, and suddenly nobody knew me, and I could do anything I wanted, and I did. Yeah. And I was having trouble fitting in school, so I stopped going to school, and started going to nightclubs, and met lots of people who were literally twice my age, actually much more than twice my age, because they were in their 30s and I was 14, 15, and they probably could have said, go home, but they didn't. And everybody buying you drink and drugs and just entering that lifestyle. And it looked like fun from the outside. And I certainly would have told you I was having a ball. And then, but the hindsight is different. And I look back and I see how damaging it was, and how much violence. And it wasn't me alone, I had a really close group of friends, and we were all started going clubbing when we were 13, 14. And, the idea that the bouncers didn't know and everybody didn't know that we were kids is ridiculous to me. It's not in the book, but I talk about with one of my best friends that we were remembering that one day she had lost her child travel card, and she'd left it in a club. So we, that club isn't even there anymore, but on Charing Cross Road in London, and we went in and got it, and then we were back there later that night. So just the juxtaposition of that is hilarious. And also, since writing the book, I had never talked about this with my female friends of the time, but they read the book, and they phoned me and said, that's exactly what happened to me too, and I never talked about it. Just the level of sexual violence from full, and I describe in the book being raped, which for me was an extraordinarily difficult thing an experience to own.
Yeah.
But also just the level of, constant sexual harassment and constant expectation that if they buy you drugs, then you will have sex with them, and as a kind of a transaction, and I think that culture still exists very much, and I wanted to write about it as a way of claiming it and being open about it and saying this is not okay.
And again, maybe not being neither sentimental, or you say in the book, like there were times when you might have joked about it in the past or seen it as a kind of funny, anecdote.
Yeah, because we have defense mechanisms around really difficult things, and I had put the most painful experiences in a box and closed the lid really tightly on it. But people knew that I had gone through several secondary schools and knew that, I had just scraped through, and it just became, this funny story about how Emily used to be a wild child. And I used to tell it as these oh, I'm so funny, I'm so hilarious. And back school when I got kicked out. And then you write it down. And again, it was partly through, because my partner was a huge part of writing this book. He read every word and was saying, you need to rewrite this paragraph. He was the only person ruthless enough to say, this is not good enough, Emily, you have to get better. He was an incredible editor. And he read the first draft of that essay, kind of the opening, and he said, the tone is wrong here. He says, the tone is jaunty and wasn't it wild? And he said, but the story you are telling is really serious. And it was only really through that conversation with him that I realised that, and through conversations with Trent Press as well, because they were really sensitive around understanding that was a really difficult story for me to tell, and talked about how, they could support me through writing it. And it was only through those three people that I realised that I was able to be serious. And to write it as a serious story and really, really claim it, as opposed to just say, oh, but I'm grand now. Yeah. Because I am fine now. But I wasn't.
Yeah. And when you say that at the time you would have said you were having fun, there must have been a part of you, though, that wasn't having fun.
Yeah.
That knew.
Yeah. It'd be 5 a.m. and I'd be standing outside a tube station, freezing, waiting for the underground to start, and thinking, how am I going to get home? At least I had my child travel card. And how am I going to get into my house? And is it possible for me to keep doing this? And you don't eat, and you take a lot of drugs. You have serious physical pain as well, and withdrawal, and being really unhappy. And then when you're around people who are also as equally as chaotic as you, it's really destructive. People hurt you emotionally in lots of ways, and you don't have any stability, and you don't have any core sense of self to go back to either. And I knew that I was letting my family down, so I couldn't talk to them, and they had their own problems anyway.
Who did you feel you were letting down?
My mum.
Did you?
Yeah. Of course you do.
Yeah. I'm just interested because, in some ways you could think that, you'd come from a chaotic childhood. Maybe, was there any sense of, I'm on my own here?
I acted like that. And I felt like I was an island, which in some ways makes me really like my dad, which is how he always acted. But my mum did her very, very best. And it was really, really tough. And she wanted to trust me and to believe that I was going to school because I didn't tell her otherwise. And actually, it's funny, again, what books can do, or what telling stories can do. It's only since describing that she and I have now had an adult conversation where I know her side of the story. One of the things that strikes me is that my parents were in their very early 30s when they split up, and I'm much older now than my mother was when she took us to live in London. And that's extraordinary. You know, when you realise you're older than your parents. And so
at the time when of events that you consider like they should have all the answers because they're
and
parents.
I'm making it up now. So, you know, they must have been then. And you realise that, like, you know, just because they're your parents doesn't mean that they're infallible.
Yeah. And you ended up on television. You became like like that's extraordinary passage in the book where you...
It was bizarre when I think back on it, right? This TV show that called my school and to ask did they have any kind of students who could appear on this morning chat show under the title Teen Rebel. Right. And my school suggested me. And I was like, okay, so I got the day off school, like legitimately for once, to go and I appeared wearing a T-shirt with my ex-boyfriend's name and is a tosser written in capital letters, and again it just shows you the kind of the balance of it that it was on ITV I think, and it was and my parents both videotaped it. Right. And both proudly kind of, you know, said, oh, Emily was on TV as a rebel, you know. And so it's this bizarre thing that if we had known really, if they had known what the reality was behind that, they would have been very alarmed. But I think, you know, that same program, there was a woman on and she was, I mean, this is where the tone completely changes because her son had died. Yeah. And of a drug overdose, and so it's not funny when you compare, when you know you just stop laughing. And in fact, you know, that was one of the reasons why I started going back to school, right? Was because 2 of my friends died.
And you say that you saw a relationship or a similarity between the mother of that on the show and your mother, but you didn't link you with the son.
So again, that woman that I met whose son had died, she had no idea that her son was doing drugs. And you just suddenly think, oh, maybe my mum has no idea. My mum has no idea. But it didn't, I didn't do heroin, for example. I was, you know, that was my boundary. So I thought I was safe. In the way that, you know, you assume you're going to live forever when you're 15. You know, and you say things like, oh, I'm not going to school. Who needs school? Education is, you know, a waste of time. No. You know, you get it wrong.
And I wonder, were you taking to drugs and because of your father, like, did you ever sense or did you ever consider at that stage or later, well, do I have the same addictive tendencies?
Yeah, I did, yeah.
And what did you decide?
I see the allure of that being the choice that you make of the thing you want to do with your life. I see the attraction of it. It gets you off lots of other hooks. It's not for me.
You say it was all or nothing for you with drugs.
It was, yeah. I you know, and I haven't done any since I was 18. But I mean, there were times when because of my dad, I decided I wasn't going to drink. Yeah. That's just actually not something that I want to do. I really like having a beer. So I do that in moderation. So I don't think you can divide people into people who have a tendency to be addicts and people who don't. I think there are, I mean, apart from anything else, the hangovers are far too bad. But no, maybe I have too much of my pragmatic mother in me. I saw a life and thought I would like that life more.
And was it a case of, again, when you come back to the letting go and having to find the right pitch for you between letting go and control, because they seem to be and I do think there is something in the, like for children of chaos or of alcoholic homes, that regulating that naturally doesn't come easily, if you know what I mean. How much control do I want in any situation, or how much can I let go?
Yeah.
And when you get into college, you say, you know, when you went in there, it gave you a form of control over your life. It provided, as you said, that stability. I
think being a kid is really hard because you don't have control. And you know, I see it because my nephew is of an age that he's like, no, I'm not eating that, you know, and he picks his clothes that he gets to wear. Like, you have so little control, so you control what you can. And one of the reasons why I for many years didn't describe myself as anorexic is because I didn't see it as that, because that disease was always marketed or labelled as being about wanting to be thin. And I saw that very much as a kind of byproduct. But the real thing was, this is what I get to say yes and no to. And so when I moved out of home, basically at the age of 19, 20, I got meaningful control over my own life. You know, I get to decide the direction. I get to decide what I want to do every day. These are really healthy, positive ways of exerting control, so I could let go of the other kinds of control. I think that's a very insightful comment about, you know, slightly chaotic families and homes, and then needing to regulate it. I'm going to steal your word.
Right.
To regulate it in some way, because I think you're right. I think that when you have a parent who's really unstable or unreliable or an addict or whatever, there's a huge amount of anxiety that comes with that. And a natural response or an inevitable response to anxiety is control. Yeah. And you actually, maybe the big thing, and this comes back to letting go, is to realize that there are so many things you can't control. Yeah. You can't control anybody else's behavior. You can only control your own actions.
But being comfortable, the struggle seems to me to be comfortable with the things you can't control.
It's really hard.
Yeah, it is very hard.
I can't be the only one, right? It's you too.
It's so hard. It's impossible.
It's so hard.
Yeah. But it's better when you can. You know. But again, that comes back to the thing of everything is going to be okay, even or else accepting that even if it isn't, things will kind of be okay. Yeah. But it's funny you talk about that, because we had Mario Rosenstock on the show, and he talked about the instability. His parents broke up when he was 14, 15. And he talked about that sense of stability being taken away. And he was left trying, you know, he was living with friends. He had nowhere to live. He ended up. So there was a lot of, again, that sense of total uncertainty. Yeah. Which is a traumatic, which is a kind of, for a child, seems to be the kind of the most traumatic thing of all.
Yeah, and I actually remember friends of mine whose parents broke up when they were teenagers. And I remember at the time thinking, that is harder than what happened to us, because we were so young that we didn't even really know. Right. Whereas when you're a teenager, you know, everything is in flux and you're trying desperately to figure out who the hell you are. And, you know, trying to be cool at the same time, which has its own pressures. Yeah. And then, you know, you get the thing that you think is certain and normal taken away from you. I mean, after my parents split up, my dad went bankrupt and his house was repossessed, and it's this weird story where he says, and I left the front door open. I didn't give them the satisfaction of breaking the door down. I was like, well, good for you, Dad. But then, you know, there were massive repercussions for that. Like, he couldn't see his children because he didn't have an address. He was homeless. He was staying with friends. He was staying in a hostel. Like, it was really, and again, you're only 6 or 7, but you pick up on everything. Kids pick up on everything, on all of the emotions. I
want to ask you about the somebody I know who's spent their life in academia said that he considered the final chapter to be the bravest of all, because, like, if you are unflinching in everything else, in a way, like, you talk about work and the demands put on you, and what, you know, and demands put on you as a woman as well, as unsparingly as you do everything else. And were you concerned about doing that?
Yes.
Because this is bringing you right up to date.
No. And, like, that essay was meant to be the happy ending to the book, right? It's like, it's okay, guys.
But you couldn't do sentimentality. You couldn't even do it then.
I don't do false happy endings. I'm really sorry. You know, I love my job. I'm really invested in it. I'm incredibly lucky in my colleagues at UCD. The difficulties of working in the current education system are by no means restricted to my university. I did send it to a senior academic in draft form and ask her if it was a bad career move, and she said, "Go big or go home."
She didn't say no though.
Basically, I think she was saying it possibly.
Right, yeah,
but, I, in exactly the same way that I think it's relatively straightforward to identify things like miscarriage or alcoholism as the great unspokens in Irish lives and in Irish women's lives. I wanted to say, well, what is it now? What are the pressures now? And, you know, partly because I couldn't have children, I ended up working a lot as a response to grief, but also as a kind of response to my sense of loss of identity. But the current work ethic towards working 60, 70 plus hours per week. Nobody works 40 hours a week in my institution, in UCD. And that, you know, has a real knock-on effect. And I thought that was worth discussing. Now, I one of the things that I was a little bit nervous about as well is that I'm really lucky. I have a permanent pensionable job. From the outside, I look very successful. And again, this is about how we often look great on the outside, but on the inside feel like we're massively struggling. You know, there were times, and I talk about this in the book, where I would lock my office door and lie on the floor of my office and think, I cannot do this. I actually cannot go on. And so I think through the workaholic practices, which are massively being encouraged by everybody's bosses, we are creating perfect conditions for depression, for low morale, for this kind of toxic competition, where if somebody else does well, instead of being able to be happy for them, you start feeling paranoid about what it means for you.
And was it about, as well, taking on that burden, as you say, without speaking out? Because you do say the expectations for perfection were mine.
Yes, exactly. I'm a perfectionist.
But given a little bit of encouragement or a bit of sort of sense of this is what you should be doing.
The institution loves that, right? It feeds off that. And, you know, it acknowledges that in lots of ways. If you apply for promotion, you know, you have to demonstrate that you are already functioning at the level to which you want to be promoted to. So there's no sense of, you know, we're going to invest in faith in you as a person. But there is, you know, this neoliberalism and obsession with money, and, you know, I'm not suggesting that universities go back to being ivory towers if they ever were, but that education is about values.
And is that being do you think people are now more in university like kind of obeying a curriculum like they might have done in secondary school? They're teaching things that they're expecting to teach in a way they mightn't have done? No,
it's funny when I make a distinction for me between what happens at the level of the department and what happens at the higher up level of administration within the institution. So one of the reasons I love my job is because I get to teach what I love. Right.
So and you teach, we should say, you teach what you teach is drama.
I teach modern drama, and which is just my passion. And I have amazing students and amazing colleagues to work with. And it's research led, it's current. You know, I'm teaching a course this semester called Memory in the Irish Stage, which looks at plays that stage plot set in Magdalene laundries, plays about industrial schools, plays around suicide. I mean, it's not a very cheerful course, I'm going to say. So yeah, my students show a lot of resilience in doing the course, but there is no sense in which that curriculum is being debased.
Right, okay.
What it feels like when I look at my colleagues in UCD and across other universities within Ireland is a heroic amount of effort to maintain that sense of interest and engagement, both for themselves and for the students, in meaningful work, versus the kind of work practices that are created in a top-down model. And, you know, it is eroding a lot of people's life. People are putting in more and more of themselves every year, and being eroded as a result. Their home lives, you know, and their own sense of self. And I see people who, you know, are being passed over for promotion who have fulfilled incredible leadership roles and, you know, created an amazing place for students to study. And it makes me really, really sad that money becomes a thing that is valued. And I understand that third level education is underfunded.
Yeah.
And the state subsidy is not enough. And we have terrible, as a result, student-teacher ratios, and some of the worst in Europe. And I understand that universities feel the need to perform at a particular level in order to look like they are worthy of funding. But, you know, at some point you cannot do more with less.
Yeah.
You can just do less with less. And, you know, it's happening at an individual level and at an organisational level.
Yeah. And on that as well, you talk about the sexism and the casual sexism that you've encountered. I was wondering what you think of the idea, Mary Mitchell O'Connor's idea last year about 45 professorships for women only. Like, will that help in that regard? Or is there a deeper cultural change that's needed as well?
Well, you know, you come down to there always being structural issues and then cultural issues. And you need different strategies to fix both of them. I think I read somewhere that without those new positions, those female-only professorships, it would take 40 years at the current rate to equalise the number of male and female professors in this country. I just don't have 40 years to wait. Like, you know, if they ever let us retire, that is. But the cultural issues are just as serious. And as part of it, you know, there is now in academia a program called Athena Swan, which is where if you don't hit certain kind of gender equality targets, your funding is threatened and then cut. And I was talking to somebody a woman who works in the sciences, and she was saying that she's been going to these meetings for years, and finally Athena Swan comes in, and at the meeting suddenly men were turning up. She said linking it to funding is the only way to make this a serious conversation. And it's a really serious conversation. But the arts are dominated by women. Women in the sciences have a much harder time of it. And the flip of that is that one of the strategies in universities in Ireland and the UK is kind of leadership training for women. And I did that programme and I got a lot out of it. And I'm really grateful to have done it because it was right for me at that time. But all through it I was sitting there thinking, this women in a room being told how to be leaders, fab, right? But this is not, you know, the reason women are not given leadership positions is not because we don't know how to lead. You know, these are major structural problems. So cultural solutions cannot fix the structural problems, and structural solutions as a result need to go hand in hand with cultural training. And why are men not in a room being trained about unconscious, I mean a lot of them are now, but being trained properly about unconscious bias and about how to maybe be led? Because, you know, I've been in rooms where I've been chairing meetings and being shouted at by the men who are in the meeting I'm meant to be chairing, and it's incredibly intimidating. And there's you know, what am I supposed to do with this?
How do you change, like, how do you stop men shouting at you without telling, you know?
I wish I knew.
And again, this thing that comes across in the book, that somehow it is a woman's
responsibility
of the
to
woman.
fix it. Yeah.
Like, I'm asking you, but like, you know.
I don't know. What do you think? But what do you think?
Well, I think men need to change. They need to kind of stop thinking that there's somehow that anything that's happening is anything other than just a necessary correction to what has been tilted in their favor for so long. And maybe I think it comes back to a lot of just to listen.
Yeah,
I think listening would be a good start to it.
Listening, and it does require a bit of effort.
Yeah, but listening requires some effort sometimes.
Yeah, exactly. And also, you know, and it happened very, very recently. Somebody, a male academic, and he said the thing that's not acceptable, but because he phrased it as a joke and laughed, I was like, the kind of the joke sexism is there, or joke bullying. I'm just going to say something really nasty here, but we'll all just laugh and pretend as if that's okay. And I'm still trying to work out what a response to that is. And actually, in the moment, I just said nothing. I just thought, I'm not laughing along. I've just spent years laughing politely and seething inwardly. I'm not going to say something in response because I don't have a witty riposte. But I'm just actually going to not say anything at all. And as a result, he had nowhere to go with that, so he just walked away. But
so you're not taking responsibility for his, again, because you say like women are always, it's always seen as a woman's role to smooth it over or to not make a fuss, or else you're seen as as troublesome or angry or all these things that are used pejoratively.
Exactly, the angry feminist. And somebody actually said to me at a conference, they said, "Oh, you know what's good about your book? It's not one of those angry feminist books."
Right.
And I'm like, actually it is. But a graduate student came to me and she said, "So I'm just wondering, what do you think I should do? Do you have like phrases that I could use?" And so she's encountering this kind of casual sexism, and she is then spending her time thinking about could she build up a store of phrases that she can say in response. Yeah. Like, why should she be expending her mental energy doing that?
What is next for you? Because I know the book is about to be published in the UK. Yeah,
the UK, the US, Sweden, France, Germany, Turkey. Yeah. Catalonia.
This wasn't the plan when.
No, I didn't think anyone was going to read it. No, it wasn't. I mean, it was the dream, but I didn't know how to go from where I was to getting the dream. It's been amazing to work with Tramp Press. They are a small, independent feminist press, and the book would not exist without them. And from that, I think, if you had asked me when I was a teenager what I really wanted to do, I would say I really want to be a writer. And then I kind of got an adult. That's not a phrase. I became an adult, thought, I actually would quite like to get a job in a university. And I write as part of my living, as part of my research, but I wouldn't have seen myself as a creative writer. So working with Tramp has been incredible. I feel like they made it possible for me, and it's like they gave me permission. And I think permission is a big thing for women, to go back and say, you know what, my dream is to be a writer. I'm going to do that.
And it's coming true now.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And one of the things that I've really, really noticed in it is, from the response of readers, is that there are so many stories out there. So I've told my story now. I don't have any more trauma. Everyone will be pleased to know. But I think other people's stories, some people need help telling their stories. So I would like to do that.
Emilie Pine, thank you so much.
Thank you.